All right. Sorry. Okay. So here is our 7.7 video. Here is our first wave of terms. Our second wave. Third. Oh, don't worry, guys. That's it. That's it. Only 37, guys. It's only 37. That's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. Yeah. All right. So we're getting to how World War II was fought and the story of World War II, which is a story that you will be told many times because American culture very much elevates this story, right? There are more World War II movies than anything, right? Than any other war that gets talked about. So we're first Amsco wants to kind of highlight where Japan is in these as World War II in Europe is beginning, right? So we've got to the part where the Allies have declared war on Germany for the invasion of Poland, and the Germans and the Soviets have this non-aggression pact, and all that's going on. And essentially, the consequence of this war in Europe presents an opportunity for expansion by the Japanese. So if you recall, they've already been fighting a war with China since 1937, but as the events of Europe progress, specifically like the conquest of France, the fall of France in Europe, allows the Japanese to take advantage of that, and they expand into Indochina. So this ultimately is also what escalates tensions too. Japan becomes further entangled in the Sino-Japanese War. And I think a way to think about this would be the Sino-Japanese War is very much a snake trying to swallow an elephant, where it really can't control China in the way they would like to effectively fight the war in the end. But despite, Japan's brutal campaign in China, it is Japan's invasion of Indochina that leads to a further escalation of conflict between Japan, British, and the United States. Because when Japan chooses to invade French Indochina, that communicates to the Allies that actually Japan is not just going to target Asian nations, they're going to target European possessions in Asia, which means that Myanmar, or what was Burma and now is today Myanmar, is fair game. Siam, or now it's Thailand, is fair game. India is fair game. The Philippines are fair game for America, right? And so the consequence of this is that America and Britain quickly move to hedge in and try to block out Japan, mainly by embargoing oil and steel exports to them, because those are the materials that Japan needs and doesn't have access to conduct a war. Now, that's we're talking about 39, 1940, going into 41. Oh, no summary. Let me pause this. And so Germany and Russia invade Poland at the same time. Poland is not as strong as those two countries. It's quickly defeated. Then after Poland is conquered, there's a period of time throughout 1940 until late 1940 known as the Phony War, where a state of war exists between all these nations, but no one's taking any aggressive actions. This ends when the Germans invade France. They do the same thing they tried to do in World War I, where they cut through Belgium. You catch the French fortifications by surprise. And remarkably, the French still had not fortified that border. And so France falls very quickly early in the war, which pretty much means that all of continental, and when France falls, two things happen. Most of France is occupied by Germany. That's called occupied France. And that's like the northern and western 2/3 of France. The southeastern quadrant of France has a puppet government installed called the Vichy France. So there are these French people who identify with fascist ideology, and they are installed into power by the Nazis. So Britain and America, though, are still kind of close. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sees Nazi Germany as a pretty clear threat, and as well as Japan as a clear threat to American interests, but popular sentiment is against intervention in the war itself. So Roosevelt really pushes along the edge of tolerability with some of his policies. So the first thing they do is an agreement called the Destroyer for Bases Act, where essentially Britain gives the American military access to several ports and bases in the Western Hemisphere in exchange for several American military vessels. It is very much a thing that benefits Britain in the short term because they're the one they need more vessels and they're like more immediately threatened by Germany. This relationship of America economically helping Germany, how economically helping Great Britain kind of persists and kind of evolves in what's called the Lend-Lease Act, where America is lending arms and lending money to the British government and also leasing arms to them to fight the Germans, right? So that like very much clearly is America. It's not neutral in this conflict, but they're not directly at war with the British. When America eventually joins the war after Pearl Harbor in December of 41, one of the earliest things they do with Britain is they come to a consensus on what the post-war world will look like if shaped in their image. So like something that's maybe quite different about World War I and World War II is that the allies of World War I had aspirations that were in conflict with one another. When we talk about World War II, Britain and America, and to some extent France, are all very clearly on the same page in the values expressed in the document known as the Atlantic Charter, which like guarantees democracy, guarantees international cooperation. Now, when the Soviet Union joins the Allies during World War II, that leads to complexity within how, how each nation is what everyone involved in the war wants out of this process. But for the most part, everyone but the Soviet Union kind of are on the same page. Kind of parallel to this is the Battle of Britain. I have an orange in my hand. I don't know why. So the Battle of Britain has this really valuable asset in the fact that it's an island, which means that invading Britain requires some kind of amphibious or air tactic. And that requires resources, and the British have the strongest air force, strongest navy in the world, which makes amphibious invasions extremely difficult. So what the Nazis can do pretty effectively is using their large air force, the Luftwaffe, to bombard and attack Britain from afar. And they target factories, and that has a great effect on Great Britain. And but then eventually the British start bombing urban centers in response, which leads to Hitler actually bombing urban centers in reciprocity for the bombing of German urban centers. And something that we won't talk about too much in WAP unless we want to is that aerial bombardment of urban centers is probably the biggest waste of bombing ever. And your teachers can probably talk about that too at length. I know I'll be ready to talk about that with my students in their book talk. And then the current the contemporary prime minister to the Battle of Britain is Winston Churchill, who shows a great deal of charisma and leadership during this period as well. Now, eventually, because of the targeting of urban centers and not factories, the British are able to eventually eclipse the Luftwaffe and make a bombardment of Great Britain relatively ineffective. So Hitler chooses to change tactics, and he decides to target the Soviet Union that to him is perceived as vulnerable, but also German nationalism and Nazi ideology was constrained to this, or defined by this concept known as Lebensraum, which means living space in German. And the Lebensraum that was most accessible was Eastern Europe, mainly the territory possessed by the Soviet Union. And because, the Soviets and Germans had signed a non-aggression pact, the Soviet-German border was not the most militarized border, which presented a vulnerability for Hitler to take advantage of, and so he did. And what's really important about this is when they're making living space, that requires the depopulation of that space to then become occupied by Germans eventually, right? So when they invade the Soviet Union, the mission of that is not to conquer territory and then to subject people to serve the war effort, the goal is to occupy territory and eradicate the population that lives within it, right? And also it would be notable in Eastern Europe is where one of the largest concentrations of Jews are in the world, which were the Yiddish or Ashkenazi population. Yes, okay, yeah, Ashkenazi population that lived in Poland and Western Russia. And the extermination, like the eradicated, that's not a word, the eradicative focus of the war in the Soviet Union can best be exemplified by the siege of Leningrad, which is a city on the coast of the North Sea, Baltic Sea, where it is modern day St. Petersburg. It was surrounded by the Nazis for a year. They cut off gas, they cut off electricity, they starved the city for that year, and millions of civilians died as a consequence of the siege of Leningrad, right? This wasn't about occupying territory to defeat someone in war. This was to create living space, which would be to eradicate those living there to then become populated by some other group. So meanwhile, in Japan, they have early successes as well, but their period of success is even more limited. So Japan attacks Pearl Harbor by surprise. Pearl Harbor is a military base on the Hawaiian Islands that America was occupying. They also invade these European possessions in Asia. They expand. They even get as far as British India. They get stopped there as well. The goal of the Japanese was they became persuaded that a war with America was inevitable. And there is a lot of complicated reasons for why they came to that conclusion. That conclusion within their paradigm was likely true because of how they chose to interact with the world. If Japan was not an expansionist imperialist state, perhaps it would not have come to the conclusion that war with America was an eventuality. But because they were, that was the conclusion that they came to. The goal was never to defeat America completely. The goal was to weaken America so much that America would be forced to fight to a stalemate so that Japan could conclude its military adventures and engagements in China, in Southeast Asia, because then it would be more prepared to fight a war against America in the future. There was a bit of an overestimation that, in fact, Pearl Harbor does not have nearly the impact militarily on the Americans as it needed to have, and the emotional impact of Pearl Harbor is immense on the American political situation and population. Americans are galvanized to change their anti-intervention stance. They quickly go to approving intervention, both in Europe and in Asia, which now means America is willing to commit the entirety of its resources to fighting the war in Europe and in Asia. And America's industrial capacity just is way more effective than Japan could have ever guessed. I mean, Japan knew America was stronger than them. The goal was to fight so hard that America would be forced to say, okay, this is too expensive for us to fight anymore. Let's just call it a draw, which is could be a perceivable and realizable goal if not for the emotion of the betrayal that happened with Pearl Harbor, right? Because many Americans believe that as a betrayal, and stuff like that. So the other thing about Asia is that colonial forces are very present in fighting against the Japanese. So there are very like in the Western Front in World War I, there were Indians actually fought in the Western Front. Very few Indians serve outside of Asia during World War II, but they see more combat. They see combat because the Japanese presence in the war. Another group to talk about, which it's not a colonial army, but it's really important, is that when the Japanese occupy French Indochina, indigenous Vietnamese people, led by Ho Chi Minh, a person who we talked about probably a few chapters ago, coordinated a very effective insurgent resistance to the Japanese, and that lays the groundwork for the Viet Minh that eventually successfully defeat the French and make Vietnam an independent country. But also, India has the largest volunteer army in the world. More Indians serve in the conflict than Americans do, and that's like a kind of, even I think Soviets probably have way more people. But those are volunteers, not no one in the Soviet Union was. Not many people in the Soviet Union were volunteering. A lot of people were being told to fight in the war. So the home fronts, this is going to be a theme that, for our purposes, is very similar to what we talked about with World War I. That because these wars are perceived by these states to be existential struggles, these nations commit the entirety of their resources to the war effort. And the same thing happened in World War I. Because men are needed to serve in militaries, conscription leads to a scarcity in the masculine workforce, which means that they have to find new people to fill that scarcity, people who historically had not been given access to those jobs, which were women, and in America's case, people of color, okay? So in America, in Great Britain, women worked more as a consequence of World War I, World War II. In more conservative nations, like in Nazi Germany and Japan, actually their politics limited their willingness to use women, but women still did work, but to a lesser extent. And then it's also really important is that Japan and Germany both used slave labor and coerced labor to assist in the war effort. So, for example, the Japanese used Koreans or Chinese POWs or even American POWs. And Germany used many of the people who were victimized by the Holocaust, like Jewish people, Slavic POWs, gypsies, queer people, and political dissidents. The tide turns in Europe around 42, 43. The Allies, when the U.S. enters, they have so many more economic resources. The economy of America is so much easier to protect than the British economy and the French economy. And so they can just churn out weapons, churn out supplies. America can produce so much food. They're capable of feeding a lot of the Allies because of that. And so attacking continental Europe is a very challenging proposition at first. So the goal at first was to cut off German access to oil in Africa. And so the first fighting is in Africa. The Axis powers are led by a man named Erwin Rommel, who is also known as the Desert Fox. He's very competent at his job, but eventually is defeated at the Battle of El Alamein. And then when that happens, the Germans and the Vichy French and the Italians are kicked out of Africa. They lose access to a fuel source, and now the Mediterranean can be entirely invaded. So from Africa, the Allies invade Sicily, which then evolves into Italy, which then becomes goes to D-Day. We'll talk about that in a second. Also, in Russia, the war also turns after the Battle of Stalingrad, which is a massive battle that has anywhere between 1 to 2 million casualties. It is, by many metrics, the deadliest battle in human history. It's fought over a very long period of time, so that's why it's kind of hard to kind of measure it. It ends with almost 1 million German soldiers. No, sorry, around 300,000 German soldiers being taken prisoner. A third of the German army in Russia is eradicated as a consequence of the Battle of Stalingrad. And from that moment, the German ability to bring more soldiers to the front becomes severely hindered, and the retreat from the Soviet Union begins after Stalingrad. In the Pacific theater, their expansion happens quickly and then begins to retract. The Japanese try to invade Australia and New Zealand, but they're stopped at the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is a naval battle. They also try to take control of a U.S. military base called Midway Island. In that battle, the main vessel used the most important vessel of strategic importance is the aircraft carrier, and Japan loses a lot of aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway Island. And then in Guadalcanal, which is an island around the Indonesia-ish area, the Allies fight a effective ground battle against the Japanese. So the Allies go on the offensive relatively quickly in the Pacific theater. They're led by a man named Douglas MacArthur. The main strategy that they use is something called island hopping. And island hopping is this idea of the Pacific is the largest ocean in the world. Japan's an island in and of itself. So, like, you have to, like, carve a path to Japan by occupying these islands that often have supplies for vessels, airstrips for airplanes, because if you have those, you can project your power and influence further out from the islands. Like, these islands are little specks that planes can fly out to and target vessels, or you can station your vessels there and consolidate your resources to then move to another island and things like that. And aircraft carriers, just a quick thing to talk about, like why aircraft carriers are really powerful naval vessels. Usually, for the last several hundred years, people have been using cannons that fire shells from a barrel to where they think the enemy is, right? And if they hit them, they hit them. If they don't, they don't. At this point, range of guns have gone to the length of miles, right? And so, in that respect, you can fire with some safety, but also you don't know where the enemy is. An airplane can carry a lot of bombs, and it can see the enemy and then drop the bombs on them, right? So it's a more accurate weapon. Airplanes are a more accurate weapon, but does the same thing as artillery shells. It's kind of the way to think about an aircraft carrier. Okay. The last years of the war. When the Allies invade Italy, if you recall, the ship of Italy is a boot. They do a lot of really good at first, and then the Nazis kind of stop them in the middle of Italy and Italy is so narrow, it creates a bottleneck. So the Allies get stopped in Italy. They have to find a new way to invade the rest of Europe. So what they choose to do is to invade France, and at Normandy, which is on the northwestern coast of France, that is like on the English coast, the English Channel's coast. That's where Normandy is. They invade Normandy through amphibious and airborne strategies, right? So they get a bunch of guys in boats, and then they go in those boats and they get on the island, get off the boats onto the beach, and it's a rough time for several of those places. It is the largest amphibious action in human history. Parallel to the amphibious action, the Allies also filled airplanes with people and gave them parachutes and dropped them out of the plane to then land behind German lines to target German artillery emplacements and other fortifications so that the Germans cannot reinforce the beach while the boats are coming onto the beach. In a particularly terrifying development, the British don't use paratroopers. In many cases, what they did was they had these wooden gliders, literally things made of wood. They would tie them to planes, and inside those gliders would be a bunch of soldiers. The plane would take off, pull the gliders with them, and then just release the glider. And the glider would land in Normandy, and they all would land together. But hey, if you want to learn a lot more about the specifics of this, take IB history, because we talk about this for a whole week in October and November of your senior year. So the Allies are successful on D-Day. France is liberated within about 3 months of D-Day invasion. They advance into Belgium. They're about to advance to Germany. The last German offensive is named the Battle of the Bulge, mainly because the German offensive pushes against the Allied line so that it goes like from this to like this into a bulge, and that's the bulge. And then eventually, though, they put the bulges straightened out, and then the Allies keep advancing. Victory in Europe, though, doesn't happen with all the Allies. Berlin is in East Germany, and the Soviets wanted to take the capital, and the other Allies were like, if we do this, it's going to kill a lot of our guys, so why don't you go ahead and do that, Soviets? And so the Soviets capture Berlin. It's a brutal battle in the city of Berlin. The German people are victimized to a comparable extent to how the Soviet population is victimized when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. One caveat about that is that the violence that the Soviets did against the Germans, which is terrible violence, it was like killing people, it was raping women, things like that, was done not to eradicate the German population. It was still vengeful, right? But it wasn't genocidal in intent. So that's like something different. That's awful, but also is it as awful as other things? Who knows? That's where you decide as a thinking critical thinker. Also, the Soviets fought about taking Battle of Kursk. I don't know why that's in Amsco, but Hitler then does himself in, or does he? People still think he fled to Argentina. He probably died. He probably died like 97.98% chance that Hitler died at the Battle of Berlin. That's my take. Ask Mr. Rappaport, ask Mr. Jones what they think their percentage of what are the odds Hitler died in Berlin. So after the war is over in Europe, the war ends in Japan. There are several battles leading up to the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Those are battles that are extremely costly for the Americans. And one evaluation that the Allies make is that to invade the home islands, which would be more deadly than these other battles because it was a more desperate struggle. The home islands are bigger than these other islands they had fought on. So the decision is to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nagasaki should be bolded. Both come with requests to surrender. They do not surrender after the Hiroshima bombing, and shortly after Hiroshima, I think within a week, Nagasaki is bombed. Several lower estimates are like somewhere between 120,000 people die in Hiroshima, 90,000-ish people die in Nagasaki. Every one of your U.S. history classes next year will dedicate time towards evaluating the morality of this decision. I'll just kind of introduce you to those concepts quickly right now. That the invasion of Japan, according to American military estimates, would be 500,000 American casualties. Nothing to be said of how many Japanese people would die. We're thinking in the millions would die if we had invaded the home islands. Okay. Also, though, we will never know if the emotional impact of detonating an atomic bomb near an urban center and not on an urban center would have resulted in the same response, right? If we just bombed the forest next to Hiroshima or the bay that Hiroshima is built around, would that have meant the same thing? And that is something that people who are critical of the American decision to drop the bomb have always considered. The war ends in September of 1945. So, consequences. 75 million people die. That is enormous. That is one of the deadliest wars in human history. This really, if World War I represented the final swoon of European empires, France and Britain cannot afford to maintain their empires after World War II. And as a consequence of the decline of these European industrial empires, new states have ascended to become the most influential states on the planet, and that would be the Soviet Union and the United States, not United States. So that's our video. I really don't want to look at the length of this video right now. I'm going to be so upset when I see this because it's 5:30 on Friday and spring break is just about started. So, 30 minutes. Rip. Have a great break, guys. I hope you had a great break if you're watching this later. Bye.